Hey guys, so here are the notes for 4.9. What we're going to do is solve systems of quadratic equations algebraically. So we're going to combine the ideas of factoring and of solving quadratics, taking the square root on both sides, and put this together in solving systems. Okay, we're going to do like one example per part for the video. So make sure there are going to be 3 parts to this and make sure you watch each of them. So in order to solve quadratic equations algebraically, we're going to solve each equation for y and set them equal to each other. And this is what we call like the substitution method, okay? Now, when we do this, we have 2 things we want to make sure we do whenever we are solving. So make sure you solve for y for each equation. Try to keep your x squared positive. And what I mean by that is whenever we are moving things over to either factor or to take the square root on both sides, you want to keep that x squared positive because it'll be a lot easier. And then when you get your final answer, you should have 2 answers. And these 2 answers are going to be as ordered pairs. So I would definitely make sure you write this down so you remember how to write your final answers. Okay. So now let's use that information to do example 1. So 1, we have y equals negative x squared plus 2 and y equals x squared minus 2. So first thing we need to do is make sure that both equations are set equal to y, meaning that we have y equals. Well, if we look at this example, we have y equals and y equals. That means we have already done the first step, okay? So now what we can do is set both of these equations equal to each other. So I have negative x squared plus 2 equals x squared minus 2. Now the next thing is, when we are moving things to one side or the other, we need to keep the x squared positive. So notice I do have a negative x squared. I'm going to move that over to the right-hand side so that I can have a positive x squared and no negatives. So I'm going to add x squared to both sides. So now I have 2 equals 2x squared minus 2. Now, this is where it's going to get a little tricky because either you're going to factor or you're going to take the square root on both sides to solve. Now, how can we know the difference? Well, anytime we factor, that means we're actually going to have 3 terms. We are going to have an x squared, we're going to have an x term, and we're going to have our constant. Now, when we want to use taking the square root on both sides, we will only have an x squared, and we will only have a constant. So you kind of have to look for those things. So if we look at our first example, notice we do have an x squared term, but we don't have anything with x, meaning there's none of these numbers that just have an x with it. We do have constants though. So because we don't have the x term, we're going to use taking the square root on both sides to solve for example 1. So to do that, I am going to move my constant of negative 2 over to the other side. So I'm going to add that. And so I have 4 equals 2x squared. So now this is just like we did in 4.5, getting that base squared all by itself, okay? So I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I get x squared equals 2. Now, I need to get rid of that square, and in order to do that, I need to take the square root on both sides. So, I get x equals, now is 2 a perfect square? No. Is there a perfect square other than 1 that goes into it? No. So, we just leave it as square root of 2, and don't forget, how many solutions should we have? We should have 2. So, what is that special symbol we need to use? The plus minus. Now, are we finished here? No, we are not, because remember, we need to write our answers as ordered pairs, meaning not only do we need to solve for x, but we also need to have values for y. So what I'm going to do next is take my x value of the positive and negative square root of 2 and plug it into one of these equations. Now, you might be wondering, well, which equation should I plug it into? I would plug it into the easiest, which I would think is going to be this second equation. So I'm going to plug my x value for where I see x and get a y value. So let's start off with positive 2. So I'm going to have x equals square root of 2, okay? So I'm going to plug that. So I have y equals, now use parentheses here, squared minus 2. So you might be wondering, how am I supposed to plug this in? Well, I would just plug it into the calculator, and this is how you're going to do it, especially for those with scientific calculators. Notice that I use parentheses. So when you plug this in, you're going to have to do parentheses, and then your square root, put it 2. Now, if you're using a graphing calculator, all you have to do is arrow over, but for those with scientific, you don't need to do that. And then for those with scientific, you will have to do 2 sets of parentheses because there will be another parentheses here for the square root of 2. But if you're using a graphing calculator, you just need 1. So then we do squared, and then we will press enter. And we get 2 here, okay? So we have y equals 2 minus 2, which just gives us 0. Okay, now let's go ahead and do the next one. So now we have to do x equals when we have negative square root of 2. So I do the same thing, parentheses, negative square root of 2 squared minus 2. So make sure that negative is outside of the square root. So how are you going to plug it in? You do parentheses, do the negative sign first, then do square root, okay? So for those with scientific, you'll do parentheses, negative, and then square root of 2, and then parentheses. But for those with scientific, you will have to do 2 sets of parentheses, okay? And then we'll do squared. And that still also gives us 2. So we get y equals 2 minus 2, which gives us 0. So now our last thing we need to do is write these as ordered pairs. Okay, so you need to make sure. So we're going to have 2 sets of ordered pairs. So our first one, we had square root of 2, that was our x. And then our y value associated was 0. And then for our second ordered pair, we had negative square root of 2. And for that, the y value was 0 as well. Okay? So make sure not only do you solve for x, but you have to solve for y for each of the x values you get. And make sure you write them as ordered pairs. So then this would be my final answer. Okay, make sure you watch the next video because we're going to do the next example there. Okay?